Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online adulthood and aging psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in social relationships. Now I will warn you that this lecture is a little longer than usual, and you may be thinking, what an asshole. But really you should be celebrating me, commending me, because I had to trim a lot of cross-cultural studies to kind of limit the amount of slides to where we are now. So with that said, let's jump into this lecture. Beginning with some basic theories of social relationships and a definition of social relationships, it can be defined as a dynamic, recurrent patterns of interactions with other individuals. We're going to talk about three different theories: the attachment theory, the social emotional selectivity theory, and the convoy model. The attachment theory is based primarily on ethology, the study of the behavior of various species in their natural environment and the evolution of that behavior. It asks how attachment might have helped our ancestors adapt to their environment. Attachment can be defined as a strong affectional tie that binds a person to an intimate companion. A behavioral system which humans regulate their emotional distress when under threat and achieve security by seeking proximity to another person. For babies, the first attachment is to a parent at about 6 to 7 months of age. It has been extended from early childhood into adulthood. The hypothalamus prepares parents for caregiving by releasing oxytocin. Throughout our life, objects of attachment are special, irreplaceable people to whom we want to be close to and from whom we derive a sense of security. So kind of the idea here, as stated, is that it's kind of rooted in kind of a species-specific kind of evolutionary advantage and kind of like a kind of a universal aspect of the human species. Because it has survival benefits. And as stated, we see these first forms of attachment about 6 to 7 months of age, and it's typically to a parent, child to a parent, and there are neurobiological changes in the child in the parent, and one specific neurobiological change is kind of the increase in oxytocin, which a lot of people kind of characterize as kind of like that happiness drug or something along those lines, but really it should be conceptualized kind of as a multiplier of kind of like emotional reactivity. So it kind of makes you more sensitive to all kinds of different emotions. In this case, kind of like a happiness, warmth, love kind of thing, but it can also prime you for other negative emotions. So kind of it's in this context, oxytocin kind of serving as this multiplier of warmth, and attachment and love to the child, and attachment overall kind of being a place in which a child can, and even, well, we'll begin with a child, but a child can use kind of their parents or other attachment figures to kind of regulate their emotions. Child's has kind of an underdeveloped regulatory system, so they're stressed out. They don't really know how to manage that. They don't have the cognitive capabilities yet to do so, so they rely on their parent to kind of regulate their emotional distress and seek their comfort when they're, when they think they're under threat. But interestingly, attachment theory was expanded to kind of be included across the lifespan. So kind of in the kind of early attachment theory days, it was very much in kind of the infant, early childhood stage, while more recent research has argued that it's kind of across the lifespan. However, individuals attached to other people beyond their immediate parents. So how is attachment measured? Well, the most common way is through the Ainsworth strain situation task. It's a laboratory procedure designed to evaluate attachment styles by observing 1-year-olds' reactions to being separated from and then reunited with their primary caregivers. Researchers start out by placing the infant and mother in an unfamiliar room loaded with all kinds of interesting toys the infant is free to explore. The researchers observe how comfortable the infant is exploring on his or her own, infant's emotional reaction when a stranger enters the room, infant's response to the mother leaving the infant alone with the stranger, and infant's behavior when the mother returns. Based on the infant's behavior in these stages of the strained situation, researchers classify infants' attachment relationships into one of 4 categories. So, kind of the overview, the primary way that these attachment styles are measured is by placing a mother and child. It doesn't have to be 1-year-olds. I've actually done this in the Democratic Republic of Congo with 3 and 4-year-olds. Anyway, so you put them in the room, in some room that they're unfamiliar with. The child is playing around, and then the researchers are kind of taking notes. They have kind of a standardized way of coding infant and mother behavior. So they're coding this behavior, and then all of a sudden the environment shifts, and the mother will then be asked to leave the room, and then the researcher can again kind of code the behavior of the infant or the young child, and then the mother will return to the room, and then the researchers will kind of again code how the infant, the young child, reacts to the return of their mother back into the room. And then based on those kind of behavioral observations, they classify infants into 4 different attachment categories. And these 4 categories are secure attachment, resistance attachment, avoidant attachment, and disorganized, disoriented attachment. And those numbers presented are primarily from kind of Western samples. And I'm not going to read through all this, but kind of the idea here is we have 4 different forms of attachment based on the children's behavior and reactions to the mother returning into the room, into the unfamiliar room after being separated from their infant. And here's a reasonably decent visual explanation of the 4 different types of attachment. And we're going to skip the previous slide, which is a video that you're free to watch, and then kind of now jump into specific attachment behaviors. Now that we've kind of a brief overview of attachment theory. So attachment behaviors are outward expressions of attachment, association of the attachment figure with feelings of security, and increased likelihood of attachment behavior when the child is under stress or threat, attempts to avoid or end any separation from attachment figure. So all this is really getting at is that we have to have some way as researchers to identify and encode attachment behavior or attachment, and the most straightforward way is to code visible behaviors, and those are again kind of just outward expressions of attachment, theoretically, and then which is basically just a measure of the feelings of security that a child has with their attachment figure, with kind of the idea that these attachments with their parent is predictive of future social relationships, the quality of them. Which leads us to the internal working model of attachment relationships. Attachment theorists argue each person has formed an internal working model that is beliefs and assumptions about the nature of all relationships, the component of security or insecurity, attachment orientations, patterns of expectations, needs, and emotions one exhibits in interpersonal relationships. It extends beyond early attachment figures, and caregiving orientation, a system activated in adults where they interact with infants and young children. Most adults provide security, comfort, and protection. So basically the argument here is that through interactions with their attachment figures, and it's just a mother, it could be father, extended family members, or other attachment figures that develop throughout childhood, and even when we're not going to cover in this class, but kind of even when you reach adolescence, their attachments include peers as well. But kind of the idea here is that through this attachment, a child develops this internal working model wherein assumptions and beliefs of natures of all relationships kind of develop. So kind of that relationships that you have with your primary attachment figures kind of being used or understood as a model and kind of a representing which creates a set of belief assumptions about how relationships should work, develop, and kind of be maintained through kind of sets of social interactions that again are kind of rooted in these early attachment figures. And so based on those beliefs, those assumptions, individuals will have certain expectations and needs in future interpersonal relationships. And so that kind of serving the basis, these early attachments, and even some adolescence attachments for future kind of romantic partners. Now, I do want to talk about, or take a moment to talk about, the different types of attachment figures across, attachment outcomes across different cultures. So typically, secure attachment is thought to be the best, universal best attachment outcome in children, which is kind of like based on kind of just reading the previous definition, kind of a bond and intimate relationship in which the individual welcomes close contact and uses the attachment object as a source of comfort and dislikes, but can manage separations. However, cross-cultural studies in different contexts have found different results, that mothers, fathers, community members are not always trying to achieve a secure attachment for their children. So let's walk through a few of these. In Northern Germany, the most common attachment style was avoidant attachment, and this was viewed as the ideal. Northern German mothers associate avoidance with signs of early independence, a culturally valued trait. The Israeli kibbutz set up a system of communal childcare to free the adults to spend more time doing economically productive work. Children raised in the most traditional form of the kibbutz, starting at 3 months, spent their entire days and nights, with the exception of a 3-hour dinner break, with their parents in a communal environment with a caregiver and several other children their age. The most common form of attachment in kibbutz-reared Israeli infants was the anxious ambivalent attachment style. Some studies have found no avoidant attachment styles in Japanese samples, and among the Dogon in West Africa, where infants are in constant proximity to their parents. So kind of the idea here, you can see that the social goals, the cultural goals within a community kind of being reflected in the types of attachment that they want their children to develop. And interestingly, and we'll talk about kind of this idea in kind of future chapters, but the idea of these universal components of whatever developmental concept, but in this case attachment, those 4 styles of attachment being avoidant, disorganized, resistant, and secure, are not found across all cultures, and specifically in cultures where a child is constantly in close proximity to the attachment figure, such as this specific ethnic group in West Africa, Dogon. The avoidant attachment is not present. So again, kind of the cultural needs, the environmental needs, the environmental constraints driving the kind of the how positive or negative a certain developmental outcome would be. In this case, what the positive and negative developmental outcomes associated with avoidant and anxious ambivalent attachment styles, which are typically kind of seen in the US or Western context, kind of globally speaking, as negative, but you can see in other contexts, they actually may be beneficial, or maybe be rated even as a positive developmental outcome. And skipping or kind of jumping around a little bit, but going next to reviewing next the convoy model. This is developed by developmental psychologist Tony Antonucci. Convoy can be defined as an ever-changing network of social relationships that surrounds each of us throughout our lives. They shape and protect individuals, sharing with them life experiences. They're reciprocal and developmental. As one person changes, the relationships and interactions change. And one way that researchers measure an individual's or a group's convoys is through a mapping technique. They ask participants to list 3 levels of relationships and write names in 3 circles. And on the right, you can see a visual illustration of this. The 3 circles being an inner circle, middle circle, or an outer circle, and with each circle kind of having specific kind of qualitative traits to them, with the inner circle being the closest friends and family members you can't live without, and the outer circle being people who are less close but still part of your life. All right, so each of us has a social convoy, a social network and support system that accompanies us during our life's journey. It trends towards smaller social networks with age. Older adults narrow their social networks to close family and friends. Shrinking social networks in late adulthood may be fostered by chronic illness and disability. Life events such as death or marriage decrease and increase social network sizes. Okay, so just to review, we have this kind of convoy, this social network, of social relationships that are with us throughout our lives, who serve kind of like a protective factor. So, times are bad, we can depend on these people, but also when times are good, we can share these life experiences with other people. Now, interestingly and obviously, people are developing constantly. It's just not you developing, but all those other people in your circles are developing as well. Thus, kind of these developmental trajectories of these various individuals are really kind of a community of development, wherein their developmental outcomes and kind of just, through their daily lives and changes in their lives are interacting with yours. So it's kind of this dynamic process, a reciprocal and dynamic process, wherein changes in one person's life can affect other people within your inner circle and vice versa. And I stated one risk factor for older adults losing these social networks and these kind of really social fulfilling relationship is chronic illness and disability. So imagine breaking a hip, and we've talked about in previous chapters. Someone having chronic illness, in this case example, breaking a hip. Somebody is then unable to drive, or go get to the store, or volunteer work, or whatever, go to whatever, some community thing that they participate in. Their social relationships can begin to deteriorate, and then begin to lose kind of their social convoys that they have depended on throughout their lives and have shared good and bad with throughout their lives, and thus which can accelerate kind of chronic conditions. So kind of, again, this interactive effect representing kind of the wholeness, the integration of development across the lifespan. Adult relationships and adult development. The size of an adult's social network is not as important as whether it includes a confidant, a spouse, a relative, or friend to whom the individual feels especially attached. In men, they are particularly dependent on their spouses. The benefits of having a confidant include life satisfaction, physical health, cognitive functioning, and increased longevity. A benefit when having interactions are rewarding rather than stressful. Social support positively impacts the cardiovascular system, the endocrine system, and immune systems, and improves the body's ability to cope with stress and contributes to better physical and cognitive functioning. So kind of going back to the chronic illness example, and someone becoming injured, breaking their hip or whatever, losing that social support is important. Can be very harmful developmentally, because it's social support, as stated, these individuals allow you to share your positive experience with, and then kind of help buffer, kind of in stress terms, or protect you against kind of severe stressors. And specifically having that confidant in this case, that very close relationship with an individual, or sometimes a little more, it could be a small group, an inner circle, but kind of in the West, kind of that individual, in the case of it could be a relative, a friend, a spouse, etc., and providing kind of a source of stability and social support throughout their life, which is associated with all the kinds of positive developmental outcomes. And interestingly, there are some gender differences, men particularly being dependent on their spouses. And as we talked about in previous chapters, wherein older men who lose their spouse are more likely to commit suicide. And this kind of could correlate here. These interrelated concepts. You lose your one confidant throughout life, and men are so kind of dependent on their spouses. Then they're kind of left alone, and then losing kind of that inner circle, that confidant, that social convoy, contributing to emotional distress, which then increases the risk of suicide. Next, socio-emotional selectivity theory. And we talked about this in previous chapters, but kind of that's the point of all these concepts. They're going to apply to all these kind of different developmental outcomes. And, interestingly, some developmental textbooks, no matter what age range you're looking at, will kind of break it down into different age groups. So I've taught some textbooks where they look at emerging adults. So they basically organize the textbook as emerging adults, young adults, middle adults, etc., and then just look at all the developmental outcomes with each little age chunk. So kind of the point being here is that a lot of these topics will be kind of redundant, because we have an integrated self. All these kind of environmental factors, which we talked about since day one, kind of contributing to development across all these different developmental outcomes. Okay, so with that said, let's again kind of redefining socio-emotional selectivity theory, or kind of reintroducing that definition, I should say. As we grow older, we tend to prefer more meaningful social relationships. It's kind of thought to be based on the perception that one has little time left to live. Social networks become smaller and more selective. The quantity of social relationships declines, but the quality remains the same or it gets better. Younger adults are motivated to pursue information, knowledge, and relationships, while older adults are motivated to pursue emotional satisfaction, deepen existing relationships, and weed out those that aren't satisfying. So basically what we have here is that it's kind of related to that positivity bias that we've talked about. But older adults, as individuals age, as communities age, those members of the community preferring more meaningful social relationships, more the social relationships becoming smaller, and it's thought to be kind of related to, or theorized, to be related to younger adults really being motivated to find information, knowledge, make new information. It's kind of this accumulation process and kind of seeking out process where you're kind of challenging yourself, you're opening yourself up to the world, and that world including knowledge, relationships, and just general information. While older adults more motivated for emotional satisfaction, kind of deepening the quality of relationships that they've established throughout their lives, or the remaining relationships that they've managed to maintain throughout their lifespan. Next, I want to talk about evolutionary psychology theories of social relationships. Social relationships are perhaps the central role in design of the human mind. Evolutionary psychologists argue that individuals who carry genes for cooperativeness, group loyalty, adherence to norms, and promotion of social inclusion were more likely to survive. Humans have biological systems fostering the formation and maintenance of social relationships based on the need to belong. So I want to talk about this because kind of in at least kind of a tacit assumption of kind of like natural selection and kind of evolution in general, at least in like kind of Westerners' minds, kind of like in general, is that it's this fight to the death and the strongest survive and kill or be killed kind of situation. But what researchers have found that kind of evolution isn't just selecting for those those kind of behaviors, those traits, but also cooperativeness, group loyalty, adherence to norms, and promotion of social inclusion, and kind of the need to belong. There is kind of a reason why these social relationships are so critical to the developmental outcomes across the lifespan. And kind of the idea here is that through time, kind of this group loyalty, cooperativeness, etc., kind of allowed for survival. Because if you imagine, thousands of years ago, humans, not having the technology, obviously, that we have today, not having the weaponry, etc., there's a very good chance you're going to be eaten by like a wolf or whatever, some kind of predator. Therefore, kind of this group loyalty, cooperativeness to kind of survive is critical, and not just a fight to the death within individual versus individual kind of thing. It's just kind of, it can be interpreted today, kind of these Western norms of individuality, but also not just, those kind of things that are playing an impact, but also these cooperative, more kind of pro-social traits being evolutionary beneficial, and thus kind of through time that kind of manifesting and kind of throughout the evolution of the humans, Homo sapiens, kind of a need to form social relationships and that need to kind of belong and be part of a group. And again, this is reflective in kind of the idea that, and you can see kind of on a biological level, where loneliness and isolation has detrimental impacts on developmental outcomes of chronic illnesses and kind of a breakdown of immune systems, etc. Which leads us to the social brain hypothesis. The great cognitive demands of social living led to an evolution of primate brains, which became larger. Intense complexity of primates' social worlds. It involved power hierarchy, involving conflict, cooperation, nepotism, and reciprocity. It led to a need to successfully navigate complex relationships. More socially adept primates attracted more mates, accrued more resources, and protected their offspring better. So kind of the idea here is, as humans are like, okay, I don't want to get eaten by a tiger, we're gonna form these cooperative groups, and within these groups, obviously, they can have cooperation, but they can also have conflict, nepotism, they can have conflicts over power hierarchy, but also reciprocity. So kind of just general social dynamics, a more complex social dynamic world that primates evolve into, and then eventually Homo sapiens. But kind of the idea here is based on those environmental demands, primates kind of, again, working together, or for at least forming groups, and that group formation necessitated by those environmental threats also is going to be reflective in your neurological brain development, and specifically size of your brain, and specifically kind of specific parts of the brain that we'll talk about momentarily. And the idea here is that more socially adept primates attract more mates. They're more likely to survive. They're more likely to gather more resources because they can work in a team, and protect their offspring better because you can have a community. It takes a village kind of to raise a child kind of idea. So kind of you can accrue resources together. And researchers have sought out ways, obviously, to measure this, and they found some empirical support for the social brain hypothesis through the neocortex. And the neocortex is basically the outermost layer of the brain, and it's involved in higher brain functions such as sensory perception, motor control, and kind of conscious thought. The neocortex ratio is the size of the neocortex relative to the rest of the body. The neocortex ratio equals the volume of the brain divided by the volume of the neocortex divided by the volume of the brain. And I'm not asking you to memorize any formulas, but kind of the idea here is that it's kind of measuring these possible, very important aspect of a human brain relative to the size of the rest of their brain. So it's a ratio of how much of this, what percentage of the brain is the neocortex. So neocortex divided by total volume of the brain, and then you get a number, obviously. And that number, specifically the neocortex ratio, is used as a proxy measure of species intelligence. It is the most notable way primate brains differ from those of other mammals. Is specifically the primate neocortex is larger. Primates living in larger social groups tend to have larger neocortex ratios. The neocortex is associated with problem solving. Primates with larger brains engage in more social learning, consistent with the idea that cognitive skills that enable individual primates to successfully navigate their social worlds evolved because of the complexity of social living. So kind of put it all together here. Early primates under threat. Groups are formed, and in response to those groups being formed, kind of neurological changes are developed. And specifically looking at primates, and then going on to Homo sapiens, humans, the size of the neocortex being larger in primates and humans specifically than other types of mammals. And the neocortex, again, is associated with all these higher conscious behavioral outcomes, such as like problem solving, motor skills, sensory perception, conscious thought, etc. And in this development, this enlarged, a relatively larger neocortex, and this, as represented through the neocortex ratio, being necessary because of the complexity of living in groups among primates, and obviously we're going to look at humans. And with that in mind, these researchers came with the idea that humans are, quote, ultra-social. Humans, as compared to other primates, they live in larger groups, appear more interested in each other's activities, engage in more cultural learning. Human brains may thus have developed greater social learning and communication abilities than those of other great apes. So, I'll state all those other things going on, but also this kind of elevated neocortex ratio reflects the type of learning that occurs within humans. So kind of this idea of social learning and culture being important to humans, forming these social relationships and these reciprocal relationships. Wherein, again, kind of going back to that social convoy model, people within the groups are developing and they're interacting with each other. How another person in my inner circle develops and interacts with me impacts my development. So thus kind of these social learnings and the importance of these social relationships kind of having these, again, kind of theoretical, species-specific role, in this case, kind of living in and developing in these larger groups to survive. And a study looked at this idea of ultra-social humans. And Herman et al. 2007 contrasted the learning abilities of 3 primates, 2.5-year-old human children, adult chimpanzees, and adult orangutans. They asked I guess you could ask chimpanzees and orangutans to complete tasks involving physical and social problem-solving skills. In the physical task, participants were presented with a desired object that was unavailable to them, unless they could figure out a way of acquiring it with a tool at hand. The social task also involved the retrieval of a desired object from an apparatus, but in this case, the participants first observed a model solve the problem. They could only solve the task if they did the same behavior that was performed by the model, social learning. So kind of the idea here, so we have three groups here: young children, young human children, adult chimpanzees, and adult orangutans. We put an object, experimenters put an object that the various groups want, whatever, banana and whatever a child would want, I don't know. But they can't reach it themselves with just their hands. So they want that object, but they can't reach it. The researchers then kind of lay out a little tool, like a little rake, basically, and place it, around the infants or adult chimpanzees and orangutans. So we have an object in the distance, and then this kind of rake, right, which the three kind of groups can easily grab. And there are two experimental conditions. Again, in the physical task, the individuals were kind of have to just figure it out on their own. So I want that train in the distance. I have this rake here. I have to figure this out as a 2.5-year-old infant or an adult orangutan or chimpanzee. How do I reach this this banana that I want? That's the physical task. Versus the social task. This time it's the same thing: an object in the distance that the participants really want, but they can't reach. There's the same rake right next to them that can be used, but in this condition, the social condition, the experimenter will demonstrate how to reach the banana or whatever the object that's really desirable in the distance. So there's kind of a demonstration effect, a social learning opportunity, an opportunity to learn from a peer and to reach that task, or to reach the desired object. And the only way you can reach that desired object is by using the tool in the exact way that the experimenter, the demonstration illustrated. And then basically we look at that and we say, okay, so how do these three groups perform on the physical task and the social task? So basically kind of getting at here and measuring the degree to which social relationships matter in learning in this kind of novel task scenario. Does it matter that you are watching somebody perform a task successfully, or does it matter, or I should say, does that demonstration increase the likelihood of success, or does it make no difference at all? And what the researchers found was that children aged 2.5 years old were only about as adept as chimpanzees and orangutans in manipulating a physical environment to solve problems. So kind of when there is no social demonstration, there's a pure task. I have this little tool here, I have this rake, and I have to reach in the distance for a desirable object. Pretty much all three sets of apes are kind of operating at the same ability. However, in the social demonstration task, 2.5-year-olds were performing better at solving problems than chimpanzees and orangutans. And what this suggests is social relationships, that naturally formed, and social and learning through kind of these relationships and being open to kind of social suggestions are thought to be possibly universal in humans, and they are very important. Forming those attachments, forming social relationships are critical kind of from day one. In this case, social learning, but also, as we talked about, attachment and chronic illnesses and developmental outcomes across the lifespan. Okay, so we established the role of social relationships, the importance of social relationships, some social reasons why, some evolutionary reasons why. We've demonstrated some empirical evidence. Now let's get into a different form of social relationships, and that is intimate partnerships. 90% of the world will marry or enter into a formal romantic partnership at some point in their lives. Mate selection is the process of choosing a long-term partner for an intimate relationship. Mate selection is based on three distinct emotional systems: lust, attraction, and attachment. Beginning with lust, libido, kind of defined as sexual desire. Freud believed libido was the foundation of all intimate relationships. Lust is part of romantic love, but also functions independently. Can have lust without feelings of romantic involvement, or vice versa. Lust is powered by androgens in both men and women, and it's kind of conceptualized an accelerator of mate selections. So kind of just one foundation of an intimate partnership being lust and kind of being sexual desire. And this is a classic kind of Freud thing. And, a little pro tip, if you ever take another psychology course, if it's anything about, oh, this theorist says something, something sex, it's going to be Freud 100% of the time. He felt, as stated, he believed that it was the foundation of all intimate relationships. But kind of future research found that those kind of three components, again, lust, attraction, attachment, you can be at high on one component and low on another component, and those rates of lust, attachment, and attraction can fluctuate throughout the lifespan. Attraction is thought to kind of, or it can be kind of conceptualized as determining where lust will be directed. Also known as passion, romantic love. Attraction system is associated with increased levels of dopamine and norepinephrine and decreased levels of serotonin. Filter theory. We select mates by using finer and finer filtering mechanisms. And exchange theory. We select mates by evaluating the assets we have to offer in a relationship and the assets the potential mate has to offer, and try to make the best deal. So kind of the filter theory here is it's a filtering process, and you can imagine kind of the filter going broad to kind of more finer or more stringent as you go through the filtering process. So you can start like from the very top or something like, I don't know, they have different worldviews to me, and that can include politics, economics, maybe religious, just whatever it is that you value as kind of like this global, like, okay, this is a non-starter kind of thing. I can't be with this person if they don't have this. And then that wipes out X amount of people. And then as you're going further and further down the filter, and it's like, okay, I got to just decide between, whatever, 3 people. This is all kind of like abstract. You could say, oh no, I like to go to trivia night on Tuesdays. This person also loves trivia, but so that'll be the defining factor. So going from kind of these large like worldviews to like, oh, this person has kind of the same hobbies as me, and obviously kind of that filter process can differ depending on the value that an individual assigns to these differences. But kind of the idea again here is that you're kind of filtering people out. Versus kind of exchange theory, so which is like you're evaluating yourself, you're evaluating others. You say, I'm really good at XYZ. This person, I'm looking for a person who has ABC, or kind of like maybe I'm not looking for specific like ABC traits, but rather I understand what I have. And therefore, I'm just going to kind of explore relationships to see what a different person's social, financial, philosophical, whatever worldview assets they have that can complement me best. So it's kind of like I have this other person has this, and I'm trying to kind of like make the best deal possible. Which by that best deal, I mean kind of the highest amount of marital satisfaction or whatever your goal is based on having an intimate partnership. Which leads us to different theories on attraction and the need for intimate partnerships. First being kind of evolutionary perspective, and this is kind of just basic stuff here. Mate preferences are genetically based. Ancient ancestors needed to increase their chances of reproducing and providing for children. Men look for women with good signs of health and fertility. Women look for men with qualities signaling good economic resources and health. This is kind of classic, kind of cliche, kind of evolutionary stuff, and these kind of difficult to test, obviously. But we've also talked about in previous chapters kind of the idea of environmental constraints dictating gender roles, like the Tahitian individuals who have kind of a more safer environment, more food plentiful, having kind of different gender roles and kind of different qualities they look for in social relationships. So you can kind of see cross-cultural differences here, but kind of this is kind of the basic generic evolutionary perspective on attraction. and as stated, for all these kind of evolutionary theories, they can kind of be a little biased because you kind of look at the world around you and say, okay, this world is like this because of some genetic thing from 100,000 years ago. So kind of making that leap can be challenging. And can be biased. So it's kind of difficult to evaluate, but this is a theory. Then we have the attachment theory, which we've already kind of covered here, but kind of the idea here, attachment between romantic partners involved to keep parents together long enough to raise children. Oxytocin plays a role in both the mother's infant attachment and in a woman's attachment to a mate. Romantic relationships are reflections/extensions of attachment bonds adults had with their parents in childhood. So you can kind of see here again, kind of rooted in kind of this evolutionary theory a little bit, with attachment being required for parents being together long enough to raise their children. It's kind of not true. It's interesting kind of theory of evolutionary change because kind of historically, kind of this idea of a nuclear family raising a child. This is really not that universal, and it's not even universal now. But kind of the idea here is that there needs to be attachment because we have to raise this child, therefore we have to be attracted to each other and want to stay with each other, so then we can raise this child. But also it's proposed to be a reflection of an extension of bonds that an adult had with their parents in childhood. So kind of, again, kind of that internal working model and that kind of example that is used for, that is developed during childhood or adolescence, that is then kind of extended to adulthood intimate partnerships. There are theorized to be 4 adult attachment styles: secure, preoccupied, dismissing, and fearful. Adult styles of attachment are related to the quality of the romantic relationships, the well-being and physical and mental health and later life developmental outcomes. The quality of the parent-child relationship that an adult experienced earlier in life predicts adult attachment styles and romantic relationship quality. It's still not clear, however, what direct role infant attachment plays in adult romantic relationships. Because as we talked about throughout this class, kind of development has all these different interactive factors going on all the time, little and across decades. So kind of the direct role is kind of a little unclear, but it's thought to be early childhood attachment styles are thought to serve some predictive value, to influence on some level future adulthood relationships and attachment styles in adulthood. A meta-analysis of 5 longitudinal studies about attachment were examined. Those original studies took place between 1923 and 1963. They included a total of 600 people aged between 13 and 73. So basically, 5 different longitudinal studies were combined into a meta-analysis and those longitudinal studies were about attachment across the lifespan. You can see here early adolescence, beginning adolescence, all the way to older adulthood. One finding that researchers found in the meta-analysis was that dismissive/avoidant scores decline slowly but steadily through the years examined. People who feel discomfort with intimacy as emerging adults and young adults gradually feel less discomfort as they move into middle and older adulthood. And dismissive avoidant, kind of being straightforward here, is kind of the idea that you're dismissing or avoiding the need for intimacy. You're kind of dismissing the need for relationships and kind of the idea like, oh, I'll do it myself. I'm just completely self-reliant. These longitudinal studies had found that that feeling of dismissive avoidance, attachment declines as people move to middle and older adulthood. The meta-analysis also found that people who report feeling no need for intimate relationships show high levels of preoccupied/anxious in adulthood and early adulthood before declining through middle age and older adulthood. Participants in relationships showed lower levels of dismissive/avoidant and preoccupied anxious attachment styles than who were unpartnered. So the first bullet point kind of being repeated more in kind of attachment terms. So kind of people who feel they don't need intimate relationships having higher levels of anxious attachment styles in adolescence, but then that declining throughout middle age and older adulthoods. And as stated, participants who were in intimate relationships showed lower levels of dismissive, avoidant, and preoccupied anxious attachment than those who are unpartnered. So kind of straightforward. People who are in relationships are less likely to have attachments that are rooted in saying that relationships aren't important. Kind of straightforward finding. Happy marriages. 100 couples studied from before marriage until well past their 13th anniversaries. Before marriage, couples were given several standardized tests which measured relationship satisfactions, relationships interactions, and problem solving in the relationships. The tests were administered 10 times over the following 13 years. At the end of data collection, the results found 3 categories of people: divorced, remained happily married, and couples who had experienced distress over several points. And when looking at the specific groups, the researchers found numerous kind of predictors of where which couples would fall into which groups. And the groups differed before, and one of those findings would be that the groups differed before their marriages took place. Groups who divorced or experienced high levels of marital distress had exhibited negative interactions with each other in first interviews. They demonstrated insults towards one another, they lacked emotional support, negative sarcastic comments, and over time this kind of creates an erosion effect. The risk factors include personal history, personality traits, and different ideas about the future. The researchers from this experiment argued that couples who divorce can be recognized years ahead of time, examine positive and negative interactions. There are 5 key components: fondness and admiration, we-ness versus me-ness, love maps, purpose in meeting instead of chaos, satisfaction instead of disappointment. Okay, so to review, we have this longitudinal study. We're looking at 100 couples. We're following them for basically 13 years. We're having them come into the lab to collect data on their marital satisfaction, problem solving, and interactions. We're asking them various questions, and we're doing this basically once a year for 13 years. And at the end, we find 3 different categories of divorce: people with high marital distress and those who remained happily married. And the researchers found that individuals who are in the divorced or experience high levels of marital distress category, the interactions between each other, those couples, consisted of more insults towards each other, lack of emotional support, and kind of sarcasm. And over time, those kind of negative communication styles accumulating to kind of deteriorate the relationships. But not only that, but as stated, and as we talked about this numerous times throughout this class, just because you enter a marriage, you're not just magically this new person. You're bringing your own risk factors to kind of the relationship, including personal history, so maybe poor relationship with your own parents or bad things that happen to you, etc., various personalities, and also different ideas of the future. And when those kind of risk factors combine with kind of accumulation of erosion, so kind of like a rocky foundation that's really not addressed, and over time accumulating, thus deteriorating and leading to a deterioration of the relationship, which can contribute to divorce or just staying in a marriage that's kind of unhappy. Now let's talk about those 5 key components of positive and negative interactions within relationships. The first being fondness and admiration. So positive emotions like warmth, we-ness versus me-ness, which are unity beliefs, values and goals. Love maps, level of positivity when asked to describe a history of relationships. Purpose and meaning instead of chaos, communication of historical challenges and future goals. And satisfaction instead of disappointment. Level of satisfaction / gratefulness of the relationship. So kind of a rocky relationship would say, or experimenters would ask, oh, tell us about your relationships. And you would say, oh, this person sucks. They're inaffectionate. We have differences in beliefs, values. I'm chasing this. She's chasing this. I value X. She values Y. And then they'll describe the relationship in much more negative terms. They'll describe their historical challenges. You can say, oh, this person is at fault. This historical challenge that we had to overcome, we actually kind of never overcame it. and we kind of just moved on, and I'm kind of ungrateful about this whole thing. So kind of like that accumulation of these 5 components, kind of being evident of a relationship with high levels of distress, or kind of contributing to a divorce. And jumping ahead to unhappy marriages, a study examined 12 years of data from couples in low-quality marriages. The researchers found that people who remain in unhappy marriages experience a reduction in life satisfaction, self-esteem, well-being, and overall health. Those in unhappy marriages report being less happy than those who divorce and remarry. Unhappy relationships, however, can be helped with therapy and relationship education classes. Kind of just straightforward here. If you stay in a negative environment and kind of do nothing to change that environment or leave that environment, then there's certain negative developmental outcomes. Moving on to same-sex marriages and partnerships, 4.1% of people identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender in a recent Gallup poll. 1 in 10 LGBT Americans are married to a same-sex partner. Majority of same-sex cohabitating couples are married. Same-sex couples have less gender inequality and gender role differences. Some similarities and differences between same-sex and heterosexual couples. Both partners likely work outside the home. They divide up household chores and financial responsibilities. The person in the relationship who makes more money does less housework. Differences include same-sex couples face added pressure of potentially having to hide their sexual orientation or intimate partnerships. And members of the LGBT community are more likely to be victims of violence across the lifespan, particularly transgender women. Contributes to relatively higher levels of substance abuse and suicide in transgender people. So kind of similarities include kind of recognizing that both people in a relationship have different strengths, weaknesses, different interests, and kind of thus kind of divide up chores and responsibilities based on those preferences and strengths and weaknesses. And then the person in the relationship who makes the most money is the one who typically works more, and while the other one does more household labor. So we have kind of wage labor and household labor, kind of to similarly to heterosexual couples. One big key difference is kind of just straight up just hardship faced by same-sex couples, and specifically transgender couples, whereas not only do you have to deal with various issues of relationship throughout life and potentially children, but also kind of active discrimination and kind of like frankly violence committed against transgender individuals, thus posing them at higher rates of substance abuse and suicide, and those kind of that mental distress, that negative developmental outcome in response to that environmental hardship is likely to contribute to kind of a rockiness within that relationship. So kind of these external factors kind of spilling over into the relationship dynamics, which harms the individual, but also potentially the relationship. Gendered effects of divorce. Young adults struggle more with the consequences of divorce than do those at midlife, as they have a higher risk of depression or other signs of problems with psychological adjustment. In an AARP 2009 survey, 44% of middle-aged women mentioned financial problems after divorcing their spouse. In comparison, only 11% of men reported such difficulties. Many women who divorce in midlife report that they have a greater release from their day-to-day sense of unhappiness. So kind of the idea here is that we have differences in age and gender and the effects of divorce. And young adults, you can imagine, who kind of get, in general, young adults who gets married at maybe 18 years old, maybe having gone through kind of less development on this, themselves, kind of less accumulation of personal resources, financial resources, and social resources as well. So maybe kind of from a more unstable background, being reflective in the consequences of divorce, because so you have maybe an unstable background, you enter a marriage early, then you divorce early, and that's another kind of unstabilizing or destabilizing environmental factor contributing to that those young individuals' developmental outcomes, thus kind of placing them at a higher risk of depression. So we kind of have this, again, this accumulation effect. Rocky life prior to marriage, getting married early, getting divorced quickly, and then being at risk for certain negative developmental outcomes, specifically in this case, depression. And then in the AARP study, we see kind of differences in financial problems, and this is especially associated with or related to kind of women's historical role in the workplace, kind of being declined or prevented from participating in the labor force. Thus, they have less kind of financial resources accumulated, and thus putting them at risk for a higher risk of poverty following a divorce. And this is especially the case for the older you are in older cohorts, who not only have less likely to have Social Security benefits accumulated, but kind of less finances throughout their lifespan accumulated, and thus putting them at risk for financial difficulties following a divorce. Now let's talk about family relationships, and specifically general patterns of family interactions. We have nuclear families, parents and their children, extended families, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and intergenerational solidarity, to which extent to which family members of different generations are close to each other. There are thought to be 6 dimensions of emotional cohesion within family relationships. I'm not going to read through all of these. You can see some of these here. Consensual solidarity, the level of same values, attitudes, and beliefs. Affectional solidarity, level of reciprocal positivity towards family members. The functional solidarity, levels of service and assistance provided in the family. So kind of these different components of emotional cohesion within a family, contributing to the levels of the quality of a family relationship. And it's kind of straightforward here. If you have different values, different attitudes, somewhat a one-sided relationship, one person doing all the providing assistance, providing emotional support and positivity, while no one else is it's a one-way street kind of thing, it's unidirectional, obviously contributing to a lower emotional cohesion within a family structure. And why might this matter? Because emerging adults still need the security and encouragement to explore, to become independent, autonomous individuals. Again, very Western framing here, but we're working with it. Provided by supportive parents. Emerging adults with secure parent-child attachments, stronger sense of identity, greater social competence, fewer behavioral problems, and are believed to form higher quality relationships to friends and later romantic partners than emerging adults with insecure attachment to their parents. So kind of the degree of social cohesion, the degree of attachment contributing to all these different developmental outcomes, and kind of the risk factors associated with the development across the lifespan. So as stated, Bowlby argues, who is kind of the godfather of attachment theory, argues attachment is transferred to romantic partners. Others argue, however, that the form of parent-child attachment changes and it centers around communication and physical proximity. Most adult children live near their parents, have frequent contact, and feel emotionally close and share similar opinions. Most middle-aged parents have daily contact with their adult children. Frequency of contact has increased over the last 25 years. So we have Bowlby basically saying the attachment is transferred to romantic partners, while others argue that really the type of attachment or the form of attachment changes throughout the lifespan between a parent and a child, and one way that it changes is through the degree of communication and physical proximity. And studies found that most adult children live close to their parents, as stated, feel and share similar opinions, and have daily contact with their individuals. And also kind of technology impacting this. So kind of a chrono level impact here of development, going back to Bronfenbrenner, wherein technology advances, kind of contributing to the degree of communication, and maybe a changing and contributing to the change in the form of parent-child attachment. But also I want to point out that some of those parents and children or I should say the emotional closeness and sharing of similar opinions between mostly being kind of very similar, or feel that they're very similar between the dyad, the parent and child, being very close it occurred 2016, which means the data was collected in 2014, 2015. And obviously we know that the 2016 large election, big shifts in kind of attitude and family dynamics, instability occurring. So really we could possibly see a different a shift again on this chrono level, wherein the feelings of shared similar opinions, and again going back to that emotional cohesion shifting in kind of response to these larger political and economic trends, and specifically I'm obviously referring to the 2016 election, and how and the degree to which that shifts and changes the chrono level of development. It remains to be seen, obviously, but it's polling suggests that different instability and a degree of shared similar opinions has declined kind of since 2016 among parents and children, contributing to kind of less emotional cohesion and more family instability. Which leads us to infection. Affection is an important component in family relationships, consensual solidarity, agreeing on values, attitudes, and beliefs. Children can broaden their parents' values, attitudes, and beliefs. The influence of young adults on their parents is an important mechanism of social change. Young members of society can pass their attitudes to older members. Older people whose children are cohabitated or divorced are more likely to be more progressive about beliefs of gender role equality, moral attitudes, childlessness, abortion, euthanasia. Older adults appear to meet a decision point, change attitude, or risk distancing themselves from their child. So here we kind of see this impact of social dynamics between children and their families or their parents, wherein younger adults kind of influencing their parents' values and attitudes, and thus possibly contributing to changes, and because the older adult is seeing it kind of, I guess, firsthand and saying, oh, okay, so this is, my child is doing this, therefore this is actually acceptable. And now I can change my mind because I see my child, who's obviously great, is doing this, therefore, it's maybe I was wrong, because now I have this personal experience kind of thing. But interestingly, older adults appear to meet a decision point wherein those attitudes, values, and beliefs may conflict with their child, and then the parent has to kind of make a choice to either distance themselves from the child or kind of shift their values and attitudes and beliefs, and kind of that decision point obviously is going to impact developmental trajectories. And again, going back to the 2016 kind of marker, again, these things are kind of in flux right now, and it really speaks to kind of the impact of the historical era and kind of the political environments on developmental outcomes at an individual level, but also within this these family relationships. Linked lives. What about effects on parents who have adult children dealing with personal problems such as alcoholism, chronic health concerns, mental health issues, trouble with the law, poor social relationships, or academic and or job-related problems, even if they are not living at home? People in important relationships such as children and parents mutually influence each other's developmental pathways. Study of middle-aged parents and their adult children whose parents those parents whose children were dealing with personal problems reported more negative affect, lower self-acceptance, poor parent-child interactions, and more family relationship stress. More problems the adult children were facing, the worse the lives and emotional health of the parents, with single parents faring the worst. So this is what we talked about throughout this class in this chapter, is that these relationships with our developmental pathways are, because we're a social species, we have family, we have friends, etc., we have an inner circle and social convoy. These our developmental outcomes, our developmental trajectories are influencing each other. Our developmental pathways are influencing each other in kind of reciprocal ways, and thus when one individual, in this case a child, kind of dealing with these issues, these social issues or health issues, can contribute to kind of worse developmental outcomes for parents. And obviously parents who were already had, in general, kind of this a rocky relationship as a child, when a child is younger and a parent is older, or whatever, as a parent, is a risk factor for continued instability across development, and that continued instability contributes to poor developmental outcomes in both generations, the parent and the child. Grandparent-grandchild relationships. Grandparents spend more time with young grandchildren but discuss more personal concerns with older grandchildren. About 1 in 4 grandparents name an adult grandchild in their innermost circle of their social convoy and typically carried over from childhood. Parents report the same affection for grandsons and granddaughters. Adult grandchildren and grandparents view their relationships as a safety net. Adulthood grandchildren represent the future to grandparents and give a feeling of accomplishment, while grandparents represent the past and a source of identity to grandchildren. So we can see here the importance of these grandparent-grandchild relationships, with 1 in 4 grandparents naming an adult grandchild in their innermost circle, in their social convoy. And we've talked about the importance of social convoy to a number of developmental outcomes, and not just for the child, but for that or that younger adult, not really child, but young adult grandchild, but also for the older adult grandparent. And kind of some theorized reasons for kind of the uniqueness and kind of the importance of this grandparent-grandchild relationship is that that the adults represent the future and a sense of accomplishment, while, kind of as stated, the grandparents representing your identity or your community's identity, a source of information and knowledge. So both kind of the relationship acting as a bidirectional protective factor and kind of a source of social support, meaning that the relationship is beneficial to the grandparent and the grandchild, and they serve and this is correlated with numerous positive developmental outcomes. And looking at grandmothers in particular, the grandma effect suggests that the presence of grandmothers, especially maternal grandmothers, has ensured children's survival throughout recorded history, theorized traits of longevity favored in humans by natural selections. Grandparents provide wisdom, knowledge, making survival more likely. Moken people, typically referred to as water nomads, elders warned of incoming tsunami, saved lives. Rarely in human history have mothers raised children alone, typically with the help of a social group. So kind of, again, that we talked about in the previous slide, grandparents representing the past, a sense of identity, but also providing knowledge and wisdom and key information for survival, I should say. So kind of this elder wisdom kind of conceptualization of the importance of grandparents. And specifically looking at this group called Moken people. We'll talk about them actually, probably a little bit in a different chapter, possibly, not sure. But basically they're water nomads. They're very much in the water. You can Google them, they're very interesting. So they're basically the idea here is that elders said, oh wait, look at this, whatever, I can tell by the weather and the way whatever XYZ is kind of acting in the environment, that there's a tsunami coming. Let's get the hell away from the water shore. Let's get out of the water, and then to save lives. So again, kind of the idea of this historical legacy, this wisdom being important to survival, and this is across human history. In general, this idea of a nuclear family of a parent and a child, just solely raising a husband and wife, wife, whatever, solely raising a child is not kind of this universal historical process. It's typically, again, kind of cliche, but village raising a child kind of situation, wherein all these other extended family members and community members contribute to the raising / development of a child. Kin-keeping. In all families, there's a person or persons who keeps the family connected and who promotes solidarity and continuity in the family. They organize family gatherings, knows the history of the family. Family turns to this person for advice and support, and strengthen the bonds in the family. It's historically, typically, on average, more likely to be a woman. In a study, 86% of their respondents named a woman as their family's kin-keeper. Mothers, maternal grandmothers, and paternal grandmothers were more likely to be a family's kin-keeper than were fathers, young adult children, or grandfathers. So kind of the idea here is that an important person to maintain family cohesion is this kin keeper, and typically it's been older women, and they're kind of they take on this kind of social responsibility to organize family gatherings, understand kind of the history of the family, and kind of maintain and strengthen bonds within that family. Again, kind of serving, taking on that responsibility, taking on that social role, and that serves as a protective factor for kind of each individual, but also kind of the family as its own social unit. So it's not just a separate set of individual, but kind of this circle, this developmental unit, this group, in this case the family, being positively affected by this kin keeper and the actions of the kin keeper. Sibling relationships in adulthood, they're typically the longest lasting relationships. They typically have better relationships. They feel they were treated fairly by parents. Relationships often become warmer and more equal in adulthood, can compensate/buffer for poor relationships with parents. They often grow closer in age. Siblings who enjoyed a closer relationship during childhood are likely to be drawn closer after significant life events, such as a parental death. Siblings who had a poor relationship growing up may clash in response to the same event, fight over inheritance, for example. So we have kind of sibling relationships that typically last the longest, obviously because they're the same age as you, and thus they're going to be alive in general, are more likely to be alive when you're alive than your grandparents. They serve the role of buffering of poor relationships with parents. So kind of an idea, you're stressed at one part of your family, but your siblings can kind of help de-stress you or protect you from kind of the worst impacts of kind of a rocky relationship with parents or whatever member of the family. And siblings who were close kind of growing up or were already close can be drawn closer together when kind of significant life events such as death occur, and sibling relationships that were already kind of rocky are more at risk of kind of exacerbating that poor relationship during kind of that same event. So kind of like, again, you're bringing that relationship with you to this new event, in that case kind of a parent dying, and the quality of that sibling relationships impacting how you react to a significant life event such as a parental death. So kind of stepping away from siblings and family in general to more community relationships and friendships, and beginning with social integration, which describes a number of social roles that you have. For example, a daughter can be a basketball team member, a humane society volunteer, a co-worker, and a student. Maintaining these different roles can improve your health via encouragement from those around you to maintain a healthy lifestyle. Those in your social network might also provide you with social support. Can include emotional help or tangible help or advice. Social relationships can have a powerful protective impact on health, and in some cases might even help people with serious illnesses stay alive longer. So central integration, so you have your social role, you have your roles in your family, but you also have these roles in your community. As stated, you can be a daughter, but you can also be a member of a basketball team, a member of some local organization. You're a worker as well. You can be a wife, etc. And these kind of different roles not only are critical to kind of your identity development, but also can provide you with another source of social support and positivity associated with social relationships, which again is associated with various positive developmental outcomes. But as we talked about, chronic illnesses and kind of depression or significant negative traumatic life experiences can lead people to socially isolate. And the impact of social isolation on our risk for disease and death is similar in magnitude for the risk associated with smoking regularly. The importance of social relationships for our health is so significant that some scientists believe our body has developed a physiological system that encourages us to seek out our relationships, especially in times of stress. A connection between the number of social connections and the probability of dying was found in a 9-year longitudinal study. Marriage, friends, religious memberships, formal/informal group associations, higher levels associated with lower mortality rates and depression. So kind of the idea here that, again, social relationships being critical to evolution, our daily life, but also our daily lives. And it's kind of reflective in these biological processes wherein isolation harms us at a biological level, putting us at an increased risk of lower healthy years lived, and also shorter lifespans. And this 9-year longitudinal study found that marriage, friendship, religious memberships, and group memberships, or being in an organization, being in a union, a labor union, being in just any group association, contributing to kind of positive developmental outcomes, and not being kind of, if you're in none of those things, increasing the likelihood of higher rates of mortality and depression. And variances of friendships and kind of group association across age, gender, and class. We have women have larger friendship networks than men. Black Americans tend to have smaller friendship groups, but have more family members. People in higher classes have more overall friends, but the same number of close friends as people in lower class groups. Men with professional jobs have friends from a wider geographical area than men who are skilled workers. Friends can cause mixed feelings and be a source of stress. So kind of most of these are kind of just straightforward, kind of just statements, really. But interestingly, I want to highlight that friends can cause mixed feelings and be a source of stress. So obviously, we all know that we have some friends that we had at some points of our lives, or maybe still maintain, which are kind of doing more harm than good, and that can contribute to a source of stress rather than kind of a source of support or protective or a protective factor across development. Which kind of leads us to this idea of friends and enemies, or frenemies, as Trippius once said. And this is kind of a little tease, little preview for our personality chapter, but I think it's important to bring it up here as well. So friends and enemies. With an independent view of self, which is more characteristic of Americans, the self is generally disconnected from other people. Generally, more relational mobility, that is the freedom for people to choose the relationships and what they want to engage. From this perspective, it's easier for people to disengage from people even if they're in the in-group, and it's also easier for them to form relationships with a new group. Americans say they don't have enemies because they avoid people they don't like. By avoiding these people who have problematic relationships with someone, Americans can try not to develop any relationships with people they don't like. So enemyship or frenemies won't develop. So what are we getting at here? So basically, we have two kind of different views of self, and the first one here being independent view of self, typically more Western, more Americans, wherein we imagine ourselves kind of as this distinct, this entity that's unchanging, that cannot be altered by anything. Therefore, and thus I'm me, and it doesn't matter what else is going on in the world, I am me. Also, kind of in the West, kind of in general, they have more social, relational mobility, I should say. What that is, that they have freedom to pick relationships and develop relationships and engage with the relationships that they want to. And kind of from this idea, this I am myself, I am me, and I can pick whatever relationship I want. I can disengage with any relationship that I want. I can just ghost this person. I can keep my friends that I really don't like on Facebook and just kind of put them on like a limited profile. I don't have to deal with this. I can avoid these problematic relationships because ultimately it really is not impacting me. I have maybe a small inner kind of in-group, but I also am myself, and I'm kind of relatively unaffected by people outside, definitely outside of my in-group, but also even within my in-group, I kind of have my own thing that's kind of unaffected by others. And this is thought of as independent view of self. And that independent self contributes to how, or that view of self contributes to how individuals interpret social relationships within a cultural context. Versus an interdependent view of self, which is more characteristic of Ghanaians. The self is intertwined within a web of relationships. Generally, there is less relational mobility. People have less ability to choose the relationships in which they engage. People often have little choice in the people with whom they are affiliated. As a result, they are people within their in-groups with whom of the individual does not get along, perhaps even to the point of being enemies. Relationships are viewed as being stable, and they see themselves as having little ability to form new relationships. So in this case here, we have this interdependent self, wherein our sense of self is kind of intertwined, is more defined based on the relationships with other people within our in-group. Thus, our social relationships are very important to us, kind of in defining ourselves, and more stable in long term. So thus, kind of because that in group of people, and you can even go back to that social convoy model, that inner circle is so stable throughout the lifespan, and not just includes family members, but members of the community. You're likely to have people in that in group that are also kind of your enemies, your frenemies, because that in group is very stable, and is in general kind of the ability to change and disengage from relationships is less likely in these contexts and in this view of self. And you can kind of see this in the different figures, where in the previous figure, they had the line around the individuals, like that solid line. So again, kind of that essence of self, where I'm kind of, I'm me, I'm doing me, I have this inner essence, and I can come and go out of relationships as I please, and thus kind of a decreased likelihood of having those frenemies, those people in my life that I don't like at all. Versus in this interdependent self, which is more representative of that dotted line around the individual, one that represents kind of the fluctuation, in the sense that the self is based on kind of these social relationships, but also kind of then looking at the in-group line, that is again that in the interdependence view of self, a solid line. Everybody within that circle, that line is like there for life. It's fixed. You can't change it. You can't move it around. Thus, you're likely to run into people you don't like. You can't really leave them. Thus, you'll have enemies around you. Versus kind of the independent view of self, that high relational mobility, that high freedom to choose your relationships. That in-group will be more of a dotted line. People can come and go out of the in-group much more fluidly, which reflects kind of, again, in the notion of independence, the notions of themselves, and thus contributes to the types of social relationships that you actually interact with on a daily basis in these two different developmental contexts. But friendship overall is thought to be universal, but the nature and meaning of friendship vary. Americans have more friends than people in other cultures. American adults have an average social network size of about 21, compared to about 13 for Hong Kong Chinese individuals and about 13 for German adults in 2008. Americans are more open to forming new relationships. They are known for seemingly being friendly on first encounters and being open to sharing personal stories with others, even if they don't intend to see them again. Giving unsolicited advice is more common in collectivist cultures, such as Turkey and Colombia. In Russia, people are more likely to give unsolicited advice, whereas Americans gave advice depending on whether it was requested. Ghanaians perceive friendships as involving more obligations than do Americans. It may explain why Ghanaians feel more cautious about friendships than Americans. So kind of the idea here is that Americans being, this is a classic a representation of Americans being overly friendly, sharing way too much information to strangers, than other cultures, having more friends, but having more friends kind of reflecting, that's kind of that number of friendships, or that elevated number of friendships, kind of reflecting the idea that just because you're friends with somebody doesn't really mean that you have a lot of obligations to that person, in the United States, that is. So it's fine to have a bunch of friends, because it really doesn't matter. I can have 2 trillion friends on Facebook, does not matter. I don't have any obligations to any of these people. Or in other contexts, more collectivist contexts, or specifically the Ghanaian context, friendships, being in that in-group means something. That means I have a social obligation to that person, where I have to be involved in that person's life. I have certain responsibilities, and thus taking on friendships and having anybody in that in-group is kind of a big deal. Thus, the likelihood of lower amounts of friendships in those contexts. So friendships being universal, but the meaning of friendship varying across contexts. All right, so now let's talk about the internets. So internet friendships. Virtual relationships are often as intimate as in-person relationships. They're sometimes more intimate. Can be especially true for those individuals who are more socially anxious and lonely, as such individuals are more likely to turn to the internet to find new and meaningful relationships. A study found that people who had a hard time meeting and maintaining relationships due to shyness, anxiety, or lack of face-to-face social skills, the internet may provide a safe, non-threatening place to develop and maintain relationships. For autistic individuals, the internet facilitated communication and relationship development with others, which would have been more difficult in face-to-face contexts. Authors concluded that internet communications can be empowering for those who feel frustrated when communicating with face-to-face. So kind of internet, again, kind of shifting this chrono level shift. We have the internet now. I can seek out people with similar interests in me. If I'm socially isolated or I'm shy and anxious, I can seek out people who are like me and develop positive social interactions. Obviously, we can also, that same developmental isolation can also contribute to me seeking out social relationships, friendships, with negative developmental outcomes. So kind of a trajectory of getting too online and then like losing my mind and maybe developing kind of antisocial viewpoints or something along those lines. So kind of just the point being kind of that the internet providing opportunities for relationships development, both positive relationships and negative relationships. Developing countries with internet access are more likely to use social media than those in developed countries. People in developing countries have limited opportunities for face-to-face communication due to poverty, lack of transportation, and distance between towns. All age gap in social media use exists in countries all over the world. People under the age of 35 are more likely to use social media. So this is always interesting when people talk about the impact of social media. It's really important to keep in fact like these post-colonial global south kind of countries who use social media at higher rates actually than like in the US. And thus are kind of more impacted by like social media than the U.S. And this can be due to numerous reasons, but maybe a lack of kind of formal infrastructure, transportation, just general lack of money for transportation, contributing to an inability to meet face-to-face, and thus higher reliance on social media, which again has pluses and minuses to it. And although, as stated kind of like by the book, 35-year-old people under 35 having more higher levels of social media usage, you can see basically for anyone below 64 years old, the rates of social media uses are really almost identical. They're very converging. Now, the level or the specific platform that an individual use varies depending on their age bracket, depending on how old they are. Which, unsurprisingly, for example, if you're over 65, 50% of over 65-year-olds use Facebook, while only something like just 7% of over 65-year-olds use Twitter. So it really kind of depends on the specific platform that's being used for the kind of the rates of use across generations. But again, we're kind of seeing a converging of social media uses across all age brackets. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking with me there. I appreciate you listening, and I hope you have a great week. Bye.